everyone, my name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong and welcome to this episode of Lifestyle Matters. And once again we have the good Dr. Savina with us. Hello Savina, how are you?
Good, thanks Fergal, and yourself?
I'm very well. So I thought today we'd talk about intermittent fasting. So can you tell us what that means?
Okay, so intermittent fasting is not uncommon to the whole world about what it really is. It essentially comes down to us putting our body in a fasting state for prolonged periods of time. Normally, when we eat, we don't allow ourselves for periods of fasting for even up to 10 to 12 hours, or more than 10 to 12 hours. There are different types of intermittent fasting. There is the most common one that most people do, called the 16-8 diet, which you fast for 16 hours and you eat for 8 hours. Some prolong that and do 20 hours and 4 hours of eating. And then there's also the 5-2 diet, where you restrict your calorie intake on those 2 days to 500 calories. And then on the other 5 days, you eat as normally as you would. Then there's also the 24-hour fasting, which people do once or twice a week. And there's also the alternate day fasting, where one day you're eating a normal diet and the next day you're restricting your calorie intake to 500 calories. Now, I guess before we go into what intermittent fasting is, can you take us through the physiological functions and what happens when we are in a fed and a fasting state, Fergal?
Yeah, so it's important to understand that we cycle between two diametrically opposed states, the fed feasting state and the fasting state, so fasting and feasting. So when we eat, we obviously go into feasting mode, and the key hormone there is insulin, and basically insulin brings in the harvest, right? So we get absorption of our fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and they're broken down into very small molecules like glucose and amino acids and lipids. And insulin stimulates the production of storage molecules for these small molecules. So we have the storage of glucose in the liver in the form of glycogen, and we have the storage of fat in the form of lipids in fat tissues. And we also have the laying down of amino acids into muscle. So it's bringing in the harvest. Now, when we stop eating, the levels of our insulin decrease. And then we change into fasting mode. And the two main hormones in fasting are growth hormone and glucagon. And these hormones then release the food from the harvest stores back into the body. So they stimulate the release of sugar, of glucose, from glycogen in the liver and in muscles, and they stimulate the release of fatty acids from fat stores. Now, there's a limited supply of sugar in the liver. There's a limited supply of glycogen. And that glycogen will last us maybe about, 12 hours, 12 to 16 hours. But after that, then we become dependent on the metabolism of fatty acids. And this is called beta oxidation. And beta oxidation ultimately produces ketone bodies, and these are very good energy substrates. So we can see how in the fed state, insulin brings in the harvest and makes us store food and makes us store energy. And we can see how in the starved state, glucagon and growth hormone release the energy stores from the harvest back into the body. Now, if you're trying to lose weight and you've got a lot of insulin around, you're not going to lose weight, because the function of insulin is basically to put the weight in, to bring the harvest in. So actually to lose weight, you need to actually go into starvation mode. You need to lose fat mass. You need to go into starvation mode. And then your growth hormone and glucagon will then stimulate the release of these energy substrates. So that's what happens in the fed and the fasting state, and those are the broad brushstrokes of the hormonal regulation. But there's a lot more subtlety to it than that, isn't there? There are other hormones that come into play in intermittent fasting. Could you take us through that, Savina?
Yeah. So I guess before we go into that, so essentially what we're saying is that when we're in the fasting state of an intermittent fasting diet, we're sort of producing a state of ketosis, just like what we did with the keto diet, except here we're not consuming high levels of meat intake or protein intake, essentially. And that was one point that I found quite interesting. So the theory is quite similar. It's just that you're doing it a different way. So when it comes down to other hormones that intermittent fasting helps with, would be it helps lower your leptin levels. And if we remember, that's one of our satiety levels. And what that is doing in here, they also found leptin levels have actually an inflammatory effect. It increases our CRP, which is an inflammatory marker in our body. And they found that these levels, the leptin levels and CRP levels, were actually quite high in people who are obese and in diabetic people. And there was also theories whether if this is actually producing a state of leptin resistance in the obese people. What they found is if we stick to an intermittent fasting diet, these leptin levels can actually reduce, and that lowers your CRP levels, and it reduces the risk of leptin resistance. The other hormone that they found that could also be changed with this diet is actually something called adiponectin. These levels were increased in someone who does an intermittent fasting diet, once again. And when your adiponectin levels are high, your liver production of sugars are reduced. Your fatty acid oxidation from your muscles and from your liver is also increased. And it also has an anti-inflammatory property to it too, through other various mechanisms. So what they found, once again, people who had especially central obesity, fat around their organs, had very much lower adiponectin levels. And if they actually did an intermittent fasting diet, these adiponectin levels were increased and visceral fats were lower. So you find lots of people who do this diet can actually reduce body fat, especially around the abdomen, and which is quite remarkable, given that it is one of our number one risk factors for heart disease.
So really what I'm hearing is that obesity is the prototypical chronic inflammatory condition. It's the meta-inflammatory condition that creates and perpetuates low levels of inflammation. And intermittent fasting can help reduce that inflammation by reducing the obesity, reducing the leptin levels, reducing leptin resistance, and actually increasing adiponectin levels. And interestingly, also, we know that adiponectin levels are actually associated with HDL. So, which is the good cholesterol. That's another wee tidbit there. So there's a significant interaction between the control of appetite, the control of weight, and the risk of obesity causing downstream diseases. Now, can you talk to us about how about the benefits of intermittent fasting in terms of disease profile modification?
So I'll take off from where you stopped just now, then at HDL levels. So heart disease, they found that, intermittent fasting, once again, it improves your HDL levels, so increases the HDL levels. It reduces your bad cholesterol, the LDL levels. They've also found that blood pressure, resting heart rate can also lower, which is what we want in people who start to an intermittent fasting diet. And once again, the state of inflammation and oxidation stress in our body was also lower with someone who does intermittent fasting, which is all beneficial for heart disease. And then if we go on to, for example, brain health, there are a couple of other things, other hormones that are into play here. I guess, firstly, they found that intermittent fasting actually enhances our GABA activity, and that can reduce our risk of having seizures, amongst many other benefits of having enhanced GABA activity. It also regulates, allows the expression of an important gene called the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and also growth hormones and fibroblasts, which are important in our brain health, essentially, to reduce the risk of dementia and things further down the track, neurodegenerative diseases, I guess, to put it very broadly. Lots of trials have been actually going on about looking at brain health in intermittent fasting, and they found that actually people are actually and especially lots of it have been mostly in mice, but there have been small cohorts of studies in humans where they've actually demonstrated that there has been improvements in the balance, coordination, verbal memory. And obviously these are small sample sizes, short-term studies, but it's really fascinating to see that doing a diet like this can actually help reduce the risk of neurodegenerative disease, especially when we don't have actually much treatment, for example, Alzheimer's disease. So it's quite good to see how things are.
Really what you're saying is that it improves the cardiovascular status of patients and reduces the risk of neurodegenerative changes simply by effectively producing ketones, isn't it? It goes back to ketones, and also in terms of the risks of cardiovascular disease, it goes back to the reduction in body central obesity and also inflammation.
Yep. And I guess it also comes down to also cancers. There's also another effect on cancers. And that's something they don't actually understand why or how exactly it works. Various ways. One of it, if you're not obese, you have a reduced risk of developing cancers, for example. And so, but there's been quite good evidence to show that with glioblastoma multiforme, it's a GBM, it's a kind of brain tumor. Intermittent fasting can actually help suppress its growth. And it's one of those deadly tumors. So that's quite amazing how it can vary from, diabetes to heart disease to, mental dementia to cancers. So,
and this is all mediated by ketone bodies, isn't it?
Ketones, yeah. Pretty much. So I didn't mention it the last time, which I wanted to talk about. I wanted to just say, they call ketones the superfuel. Because it produces a lot of ATP molecules compared to when you use glucose to produce ATP molecules. So
it actually produces more ATP than
I don't
glucose.
know. Yeah, it does, and there are lots of other benefits from it.
So really, if we're looking at the intermittent fasting diet, for a lot of our viewers, they're going to be interested in the weight loss properties. So, does it actually cause weight loss? I mean, can you actually eat your normal food amount in, 8 to 12 hours in the day and still lose weight?
I think it comes down to, remember we talked about what's sustainable as a diet. Intermittent fasting is one of the most sustainable diets as opposed to, doing a keto diet or a low carb diet. It's a lot easier to do where you're sort of sticking to your usual range of foods, but just restricting to the time. So yes, it does promote weight loss. It is equal to any other calorie restricted diet. But I guess then it comes down to if you find that it is a diet that works for you, suits your lifestyle, it will definitely produce weight loss. It also comes down to you can't just do it with diet. Obviously, diet's 80% of it. You've got to also do it with exercise, because once again, these diets, they've actually found that those ketone bodies and things, the weight loss, the diabetes, the insulin resistance improving, all that was augmented with exercise combined with it. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And it's also what you're going to be compliant and what you're going to find sustainable with your life.
Yeah.
Really.
Now, are there any downsides to the intermittent fasting diet? What are the side effects?
Yeah, so I guess it's just like with any diet, honestly. When you start if you're used to snacking throughout the day and not having prolonged times of fasting, it can produce some changes in your body where you might have trouble sleeping. You might feel a bit tired. You might feel a bit dizzy while your body's just trying to get that, natural, reaching a homeostatic state in your body. Some people might get quite irritable, but in the end, it all settles. If you stick to it, your body adapts. Your body adapts to things.
Yeah.
And obviously, there are certain limitations. Not everyone can do this. People who are pregnant shouldn't be pregnant or breastfeeding, because obviously there's other requirements that are ongoing. So they're not to be doing an intermittent fasting. Anyone with an eating disorder shouldn't be doing it either.
What about type 1 diabetes?
Yeah, type 1 diabetes, I'll be talking to your doctor first before you actually go and do this, for sure.
It requires a certain
even
amount
type
of
2, I'd say
monitoring.
talk to your doctor.
Yeah, so any diabetic we would recommend that you actually have a chat with your doctor first. And also, I think I need to make the point, I had a patient that I recommended intermittent fasting for. And he came back to me and said, yeah, it's working great. So I'm eating my breakfast, the first meal of the day, at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'm waiting 12 hours to eat my dinner, and then I'm waiting another 12 hours to eat the next meal. I think it's important to emphasize that once you start eating, you've already kicked in the insulin. So therefore, there's no point in fasting again until you're prepared to do another at least a 12-hour fast, because it takes about 12 hours for the levels of insulin to go down, so that you can then kick in with the other hormones, which then can produce the ketone bodies ultimately.
And I'd like to chip in with that, though. Some people say a dash of milk with their coffee in the morning. That's, and then that's still part of their fasting period,
Well,
which it
no,
isn't,
it's
because
not. No.
yeah.
Fasting means fasting. So
And
it's black tea, black coffee until you actually break your fast, which could be any time from 9 o'clock through till midday. The other type of people that I think we'll be talking about diseases in later episodes, but just in this particular context, I actually recommend intermittent fasting and exercise for patients suffering from polycystic ovarian syndrome, because they've got a genetically predetermined elevation in insulin resistance, which means they've always got insulin floating around their system, which means that they find it very difficult to lose weight. So intermittent fasting up to 16 hours a day gives the body, or their body, enough time to actually lose their insulin, to then allow the other hormones room to play, to then start encouraging lipolysis, which means losing fat mass, which then means beta oxidation, which then means production of those ketones for all those other benefits, and also losing weight. So I recommend intermittent fasting for PCOS with increased levels of activity, as you've already mentioned.
Yeah. And I guess one more point I just wanted to make, Fergal, about a practical point, more about the intermittent fasting. And this is something that they're sort of still trying to figure out if there is actually true value in this, is that, most people sort of break their fast at 11 or 12 o'clock and eat till about 7 or 8 o'clock, whatever their time period is. But there's been actually some studies that are actually looking at, is it better if we break our fast a bit earlier and finish up eating earlier? So finishing up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so you're having a longer fasting period before you actually go to bed. So you're actually using more energy up and things. That whole diurnal circadian rhythm variation. But,
So the argument is, do you miss breakfast or do you miss dinner?
Yep.
Yeah.
What do you prefer? Essentially,
I cannot sleep if I'm hungry, so I could never miss dinner, but I could fast throughout the day. So there's no way I'm ever missing dinner.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Whatever diet you choose, in the end, it has to come down to what's sustainable, what works for your lifestyle, essentially.
Yeah. All right, Savina. Well, thanks very much for your pearls of wisdom as usual, and I look forward to chatting with you again very shortly.
Thanks, Fergal. See you next time.
That's all for today's episode. My name's Dr. Fergal Armstrong. We'll see you soon.